Hi everyone, I've got another shirt to show you. It's psychological. That's about as close to a joke as I guess I'm going to get today. Today's video is on continuity. You'll remember that there are two interpretations of Darwin's assumption of continuity. One is called Raise the Beasts. That's the interpretation that George Romanes had. Remember that Romanes had this anecdotal method. He told stories about how smart other animals are. They're smart like people are. So there's the dog that could unlatch the garden gate right away and go out, and wow, what a smart dog that was. Romanes collected up stories about how smart other animals besides humans are. I wanted to tell you another one of these stories. It's about earwigs. Earwigs are little bugs, and they tend to be like scavengers. They're completely harmless, even if they might look a little strange to you and me. So the story that Romanes learned about, he learned from basically a friend of his who lived down the street and around the block and who had a family. And in this house and the family, there was a mother and some kids. And the kids would eat their meals at a table in the kitchen at regular times, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And after a while, the members of the household noticed that these earwigs, these little bugs, would come out of the woodwork at certain times of day, and they would scavenge around on the floor and get the crumbs that the kids had dropped from when they were eating their meals. And of course, the earwigs would show up at just these certain times of day around when the kids were eating. So Romanes said, wow, the earwigs are really smart. Look at what they can do. They have these great intellectual abilities. He said, essentially, the earwigs can tell time. They're just like humans. Maybe at least some of them are basically like looking up at the clock, right, and going, whoa, it's 7 o'clock in the morning. It must be mealtime. Let's go. Let's go out and get those crumbs that are going to be there. So Romanes collected up stories like this. It's easy to be skeptical of a story like that and to maybe try to explain it in another way. Okay, so remember that the other interpretation of continuity comes from Lloyd Morgan, or certainly is advocated by Lloyd Morgan. It's called Lower the Humans, right? And this interpretation says that people are not as amazing and sophisticated and clever and intellectual as we tend to think that we are, just because what we can do, our behavior, our cognitive abilities can be explained in relatively simple terms, using relatively simple concepts, not altogether different at all from the way that abilities can be explained that other animals have. So this is, of course, really about Morgan's canon then, right? Or what's called the law of parsimony. Parsimony means simplicity or simple. So Morgan's canon, or the law of parsimony, says whenever possible, use the simplest explanation to explain the behavior or the other abilities of animals, including people. So you could see where this could be applied to the dog that had, for Romanes, this amazing ability to figure out how to open the garden gate. Morgan would say, no. It's actually pretty simple what the dog is doing. The dog, through trial and error, fiddled around with the latch on the garden gate, maybe for a long time, maybe over many days, and at first didn't figure it out at all, but maybe by accident just did the right thing, and the latch opened up and the dog went out of the gate. And then, kind of like the cats in the puzzle boxes for Thorndike, the dogs got gradually better and better at getting out of the gate because they gradually learned some, pretty simple associations involving, here's the gate and the latch, and this is what to do, how to behave with respect to the gate and its latch. So Morgan would say, use a simpler explanation. There are lots of other examples and applications of the law of parsimony here. I wanted to give you a few other things to think about. So remember the story with Romanes' earwigs, right? The earwigs probably weren't really telling time. there's a simpler way to explain their behavior. Probably what they learned was a set of simple associations involving getting food, and probably something about the way that the room looked at certain times of day, or maybe the way it smelled. So that those would become associated with food. So, for example, at 7 o'clock in the morning, the way the sun comes into the room, the shadows that are cast, things like that, might make the room fairly distinctive. And when the earwigs look out, they've learned, the way the room looks at this time of day goes with the good possibility that there's going to be some food on the floor that they can scavenge up. So they learn fairly simple associations instead of being amazing time tellers. There are other examples. Think about a gymnast doing a floor routine, Olympic gymnast, right? These are people with tremendous talent, or at least that's what we're often told by the commentators if you watch a show or a video where there's a gymnast there, right? And the people commentating will say, wow, he's a natural, or she's just seemed to be born to do this. But we know better, right? These people have trained for hours and hours and hours. And in fact, if we were there to watch them, we could see that while what they're doing is relatively sophisticated and complicated, that we can understand it, right? They weren't just born that way genetically and boom, they're amazing gymnasts. They put lots of hours into practicing particular movements, particular routines, and stringing together a repertoire of different behaviors. So not hard to understand, but relatively simple to explain. I recently put on Notebowl a short video of what I've been calling the Pylon Bear. So if you check that out, or maybe you have, you might say, wow, that bear is so smart. That bear knows exactly what to do with that pylon. Kind of like the dog with the garden gate, and maybe that's the case. But if we practice using the law of parsimony, we might say instead that perhaps this bear, for example, noticed someone else putting out pylons and then maybe straightening them back up. And the bear learned by imitation about what to do. Bears are, they're pretty smart. They pick up on things like that. They weren't born knowing about what to do with pylons that are down on the side of the road. But we can explain what they can do by thinking about what their history might be in relatively simple terms. An example that's maybe a little bit more applicable to psychology might be for example, try to explain anxiety in humans. Recently, you were reading about Freud and psychoanalysis. Freud said that to explain anxiety, which he might call hysteria or neurosis, that, to use his theory, that when a person is young, they might have parents that are very narcissistic. And so because of that narcissism, the young infant is neglected by their mother and their father. And as a result, their id urges are not satisfied. And so those id urges have to be repressed. This creates a bunch of psychic tension. And later on, that psychic tension builds up in a person's life. And Freud said, in adulthood then, almost inevitably, that kind of psychic tension would result in abnormal behaviors. For example, anxiety. And this is a really interesting and sometimes popular view, right, in psychology, but it's relatively complicated. It's an involved theory. It's got a number of assumptions in it. It's relatively complicated. In contrast, we saw that, for example, John Watson, who was also interested in anxiety, think about little Albert, right? Watson might say, no, Freud, that's way too complicated. That's wrong. We can explain anxiety in much simpler terms. Think about little Albert. What happened with little Albert that was the basis of his upset in the presence of furry things was that little Albert had associated two fairly simple events. Seeing a white furry rat and hearing a loud noise. The white rat and the loud noise become associated so that later on, when little Albert simply sees the white fuzzy thing, it makes him upset. It's a relatively simple explanation of anxiety, much simpler than Freud's. We see the law of parsimony there. And actually, this is quite useful, as it turns out, because one of the bases in experience for human anxiety and anxiety disorders is classical conditioning, which means the association of relatively simple events. This is not to say that anxiety is simple or benign. It can be devastating and complicated, but at its heart are learning fairly simple associations between stimuli, events, people, groups of people, places, depending on the anxiety disorder, and threats or trauma or potential trauma, basically bad things. And those simple associations explain a lot about why people feel anxious. So human abilities can be explained relatively simply. Don't forget about the law of parsimony or Morgan's canon. Thanks for watching.